So I'm continuing to talk about the sound stimulus and the ear. We're really at the point of talking about the ear now, and we finished up with the sound stimulus, at least where we are going to get for a little while. The three parts of the ear, if you remember, are the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And we had just started going through the three parts of the outer ear. And we started with the pinna, which you can see in this picture is that outside part of, again, as we usually say when we're talking about someone's ears, we're talking about their pinnae. And then we're going to move into this auditory canal, which is, again, about 3 centimeters long. It is filled with wax. It protects the tympanic membrane and the middle ear, so the tympanic membrane being the eardrum, and the middle ear are those 3 tiny bones. It has a certain resonance to it. So it has a resonant frequency that is reinforced the most within the your particular auditory canal, given its exact length and its shape and its diameter and all of that. So I usually give this example of if you really enjoy somebody's voice and somebody else says, I don't know that I really like their voice very much, that their voice is probably resonating well in your auditory canal and not so much in your friends. The other part of the outer ear is the eardrum, which is also known as the tympanic membrane. I like to call it the tympanic membrane and use the official name because it reminds you that it is a membrane, as you can, which it means that it's flexible. As we're going to see in the inner ear, as we get into the inner ear as well, we have these membranes that are very flexible and can move. The middle ear is made up of the 3 tiniest bones in your body, the ossicles, as they are known altogether, which are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, okay, which stand for, or they mean, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. And I'm not a very mechanical person, so it doesn't really help me. If you can imagine this kind of lever action that at one end, that is larger, and we are taking this kind of pressure and force and putting it onto this small stapes, which is going to be pushing and pulling on that oval window, that what we're trying to do here is amplify the sound because we're moving from an air system so far through the auditory canal, hitting the eardrum, and here in the middle ear, we're in an air system. And when we go into the cochlea, we're going to be in a liquid system. And I usually remind people, so if you've ever done the thing, if you haven't done this, you might really want to put something out. So get in your tub or something and put your ears under the water. But you've probably done it when you were swimming, that you were with your friends and you're under the water and they're yelling and playing with you or something, and you can't really hear them at all. It's very muffled and quiet. So we need to amplify that sound as we are going to get it into a liquid or fluid system. So as I said, the point of that lever action of the hammer, anvil, and stapes, yes, I usually flip back and forth between malleus, incus, and stapes. Oh, I did do it. It was later. The hammer, anvil, and stirrup is that we're going from the eardrum to the oval window. We're moving from an air system to a liquid system. So we use this kind of lever action in order to amplify that sound. Another thing that's happening in the middle ear, though, is that we're dampening high intensity sounds, and you might wonder how we're doing this. But so if something's really loud, especially if we're in a concert or somewhere where it's kind of remaining pretty loud, we're in our industrial workplace, that the middle ear muscles can attenuate that sound and dampen high intensity sounds by kind of tightening, so that we're not hitting so hard, if you will, so pushing and pulling so hard with that stapes. This does not work for things like gunfire that are very sudden. As we get into the inner ear, which is called the cochlea, as I already kind of mentioned before when talking about the middle ear there, and it was showing this little part of the cochlea that it started with the oval window that the stirrup was pushing and pulling on, and that is then attached to this scala vestibuli, this area that's above the cochlear partition. And then below the cochlear partition, we have the scala tympani. And I usually try to show this a bit with my light, but this is basically what's showing here is the cochlea, dead cochlea that's been severed at a certain point, and you can see the scala vestibuli, that top little oval. and then the bottom little oval is the scala tympani coming back through. And remember, there's liquid in all of this, and between them is the cochlear partition, and that's where the action is, really. If you remember, in the eye, we got things to the retina, and I said this is where the action is, this is where vision is taking place, transduction. This is where we are in the ear, is the cochlear partition. As we get that liquid that is really moving like a wave in response to these sound waves that are then the stapes is pushing and pulling on the oval window, we're causing these waves in this liquid. So that's on the oval window. The liquid goes through the scala vestibuli, back through the scala tympani, and hits the round window in that bottom area. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about the basilar membrane, which is really a membrane that is part of that cochlear partition. So if we look at the bottom picture, it's showing again the scala vestibuli and that top oval and the scala tympani in the bottom, and that the cochlear partition is between those. And part of this cochlear partition is the organ of Corti, which is made up of the basilar membrane. So again, a membrane at the bottom, which he's trying to show there in green. And then we see hair cells, so outer hair cells and inner hair cells, as we are in those darker red cells. But we have all kinds of phalangeal cells and other cells in there. And if you see the blue tongue-looking thing, so in the top picture, that tongue-looking thing that's over the top, that's called the tectorial membrane. And all of this makes up the organ of Corti, which is really, again, the part of the cochlear partition where the action is taking place, where we're going to see transduction. Here's just a nice picture with an electron scanning microscope, which gives us a nice three-dimensional kind of picture of the inner hair cells, which we're going to be talking about as doing the transduction, the outer hair cells, some of those phalangeal cells, some of those other cells that are part of the organ of Corti. Okay, so I usually do this little dance in front of the class of the basilar membrane going up and down and the tectorial membrane kind of shearing across. And I'm sorry, you're going to have to kind of imagine that little dance. But we have in the inner ear, there are inner hair cells, about 3,500 per ear. They are responsible for transduction through the bending of their cilia. So cilia means hair, and they look like little hairs. They look like little cells with little tiny hairs on the top. Those cilia are what are bending back and forth, depolarizing and hyperpolarizing. We also have some outer hair cells, about 12,000 per ear, that are going to increase the vibration of the basilar membrane, where for the specific frequencies of sound that we want to hear. And so we're going to talk about those again. The basilar membrane itself, remember, this is a membrane, so it's loose and it's flexible. It's really supporting the organ of Corti. It's vibrating up and down in response to the sound. So you can imagine this kind of liquid waving through. And most people describe it as kind of like the wave of an ocean, or if you snap a rope, where there's going to be a place of kind of maximal displacement, but we see this kind of wave through. And that basilar membrane, which is running all the way through that little shell, that's going to be responding to that wave in the liquid. Okay, and it's vibrating up and down in response to those sound waves. And then the tectorial membrane, if you go back in your mind to the picture, that it's a kind of a tongue-looking thing that is hanging out over top of those hair cells. It is so kind of shearing back and forth, okay, across the inner hair cells. I'm still doing the little dance, even though nobody can see me, but it's you kind of have to imagine that basilar membrane's moving up and down, and it's got the hair cells on it and all those other cells, and the tectorial membrane is over top. And because of the way, if you go back and look at that picture, that kind of what looks like a little muscle, but it's this membrane that's going up, that's going to cause it to shear back, move back and forth as I'm moving up and down, if I'm the basilar membrane. Okay, so looking at this from a different perspective, which I'm going to use the bottom picture of showing those inner hair cells, and again, the outer hair cells. I'm assuming this is a different kind of just a different perspective with the electron scanning microscope, because we have this nice three-dimensional picture. But it's the inner hair cells that are doing most of the transduction. My understanding is the outer hair cells do a little bit, but we're going to talk about them in a really different way, and so I tend to ignore that the inner hair cells are doing the transduction. And you can see my word art is up there reminding me to sing it, right? Transduction. This is the magic that happens where we change those changes in sound pressure or air pressure that are sound waves into something electrochemical that the brain can understand. And what the inner hair cells are doing as that tectorial membrane is shearing back and forth is that they're depolarizing as the tectorial membrane takes those little hairs of the hair cells, the little cilia, and pushes them one way, and they're going to release neurotransmitter, and then they're going to be pulled the other way, and they're going to hyperpolarize, and they're going to stop the release. So they're going back and forth of releasing, stopping, as that basilar membrane is waving and that tectorial membrane is shearing. And your author has an excellent picture that I usually put up on the overhead projector, but I just don't have any way to get it into slides because they don't give it to me from the publishers. But on page 271, figure 11.18, it shows how those little hairs at the top have these kind of links between them, and when they go one way, when they're being pushed basically by the tectorial membrane, they are opening those channels for potassium and calcium to flow in, and when they are going the other way, so they're being pulled the other way, those little channels get pulled shut by those tip links, these little things that are connecting them, and pull the other way, they get closed shut. And so that's going to be happening, as we're going to talk about, in response to the condensation and rarefaction. So depolarize, condensation, depolarize, rarefaction, hyperpolarize, condensation, depolarize, rarefaction, hyperpolarize. And if you don't remember what those terms mean, you might want to go back and just go through that little bit of the first talk, because that's important, of those those air molecules coming together and coming closer together for more air pressure, farther apart as we're getting less air pressure, coming back together and farther apart as those are making up our sound waves. Okay, so I'm going to say a few things about auditory transduction, and I don't know if you can tell this, but that top auditory transduction title of the slide, that is a link. And I'll make these links available, but I'm going to tell you that I don't keep showing these videos. They are very helpful, but I need to move forward. I really like the one about complex sounds, but if you feel like auditory transduction is a bit much for you, I have one now and I have one later that both of them have at least some kind of animation. I can't remember if the second one you actually get to play a little bit with the animation. But just so you know, those links are there as recommendations, but I'm not assuming them as part of the 50 minutes that I'm assuming you guys watch this for 50 minutes and that you read your book like you normally would if you were going to classes. So starting again, we're in an air system. Those sound pressure waves, those sound waves that are the air pressure, more air pressure, less air pressure, so those molecules coming together and apart. That's going down an air system of the canal of the air, and then the auditory canal, hitting the eardrum, hitting which is pushing and pulling on the malleus, which is pushing incus and stapes. So hitting those, we're still in an air system, and the stapes is pushing and pulling on the oval window. And now we're in a fluid system. And here's a nice picture of the cochlea, and it does look like a seashell, right? Other than the semicircular canals, which are our vestibular system and our balance. Otherwise, that cochlea looks like a seashell. That's all fluid up in there. That cochlear fluid, we see the cochlear partition, the basilar membrane, and that wave is going to go through that cochlear fluid from pushing and pulling on the oval window all the way down to the round window, influencing the basilar membrane in between. Okay, I don't know if you guys have really noticed that when things get a little complicated like this, I tend to tell the story from a picture, and then do it again with the words on a slide. Part of this is to make sure I say everything I want to say, and part of this is to make sure that you guys aren't kind of freaked out by the fact that I get pretty excited about telling the story from the picture, and I feel like I'm telling a story, and it's not about necessarily are people able to take notes and everything, but the notes are here, and however you figure this out for yourself, do it the way you need to, but I almost always have somewhere the language on a slide. So I'm just going to walk us back through that process that I just went through very quickly with the picture. So the pinna, that outer part of the ear that we see, it really captures those sound waves. It funnels that air pressure into those waves into the auditory canal, which is then hitting the tympanic membrane that's going to vibrate back and forth in time with the sound waves. Remember, we're seeing changes in air pressure back and forth. So we're going to see that tympanic membrane vibrate back and forth. The tympanic membrane moves the malleus, which moves the incus, which moves the stapes, which pushes and pulls on the oval window. Now we were just in an air system. We're going to now go into a liquid system. We see these pressure bulges move down the scalar vestibuli, so that kind of wave of liquid displacing the basilar membrane up and down. The tectorial membrane is shearing across the organ of Corti, and it's moving cilia atop the hair cells, going back and forth, back and forth. Flexing the cilia initiates depolarization in the hair cells. We have an inward flux of potassium and calcium, okay, both positively charged ions. If it bothers you a little bit, it's annoying that this is really different because the environment that those inner hair cells are in, that fluid in the cochlea is a different environment than extracellular fluid. So we see this inward flux of potassium and calcium, and that causes neurotransmitter to be released into the synapse between the hair cells and the auditory nerve fibers. Okay, so now I'm communicating to the auditory nerve fibers, which then can carry the information back to the brain. And here I actually, so I'm going to not re-record this, as I keep re-recording things as things get complicated and I mess up. But pretty sure this link still works. I'm going to go test it. I think, if I remember correctly, that first one is a short video, and this is more like things you can play with and use some animation to figure out and have it explain to you auditory transduction. So if I've just gone through that a couple of times and you still feel like, whoa, I mean, it's really kind of complicated, and it really helps to see, I think, the cochlea and the way it's shaped and this kind of liquid moving through to kind of imagine how this is happening. Okay, so I'm coming back to the outer hair cells, which, as I said before, they're not doing the transduction. Those are the inner hair cells, and the outer hair cells are having this motile response on the basilar membrane, okay, which is causing the basilar membrane to vibrate more, or to go up and down more at certain places depending on the frequency of the sound we're listening to. So we have the stimulus or stimuli, so the changes in air pressure that are occurring because of the particular sound waves that we get. The basilar membrane is vibrating. This is causing the inner hair cell cilia to bend back and forth, which is causing depolarization, hyperpolarization, depolarization, communication, synapsing on the auditory nerve, okay, which is going to take that information to the brain. But what this circle is trying to show is, as the basilar membrane is vibrating, the outer hair cell cilia also bend. And what that little picture that I've thrown in there at the bottom right is showing is that when they bend one way, because remember the tectorial membrane is shearing back and forth, just like it is across the inner hair cells, but when it's doing with this with the outer hair cells, and it's pushing those outer hair cells, it causes those outer hair cells to elongate. So the cell actually elongates and pushes down on the basilar membrane. And when the tectorial membrane comes back the other way, so that this hair cell, the cilia, are coming the other way. This causes the cell to contract, and so it's going to pull up on that basilar membrane. So again, depending on the particular frequency we're listening to is how much we're going to see this extra motile response of those hair cells elongating and contracting and pushing and pulling on the basilar membrane, which is causing more vibration at particular points. So as I have here in the picture, the outer hair cell cilia bend, causing a motile response, just a movement response in the outer hair cells that's amplifying the action on the basilar membrane. Basilar membrane vibrates, inner hair cell cilia bend, communicating with the auditory nerve. So that's having that really circular kind of amplification at certain places on the basilar membrane. I'm going to start talking about frequency coding on the basilar membrane, or really how we code for pitch there in the cochlea. Okay, and it's a little bit complicated, as there are a couple of main theories. They're both answering our question to some extent. They're both correct. I'm going to start with place theory. We're going to get cut in the middle, and you're going to have to come back at the second bunch of, or the second video for today. But so place theory comes from Jorg von Becasey, who stated that it depends on the place along the basilar membrane where neural firing is the highest. So remember, we have this kind of wave going through in the liquid, which is like an ocean wave or the snap of a rope, where it's going to be highest. We're going to have a peak at some point, and the place along the basilar membrane where we see that peak is where we're going to see it's going to correspond to the frequency of the sound, which gives us our coding for pitch. Okay, this is observed, or he did this by observing the vibration of the basilar membrane itself, and he observed a traveling wave. But just so you know how he was doing this, this was quite a while ago. I want to say it was the 50s or 60s that he was using the cochlea of dead animals, and so this was all in a dead cochlea based on, and he would send it these little signals to cause the traveling wave, and he would observe it. Based on these observations, Becasey built a model of the cochlea considering these physical properties of the basilar membrane, that it was narrower and stiffer at the base than it was at the apex. Okay, and I'm going to go on into this next one before I stop here. I usually draw this on the board, on the whiteboard, and it looks terrible, and it looks terrible here too. I really am not an artist. But if you imagine that cochlea, so ignoring the semicircular canals, we're looking at the cochlea that looks like a seashell, right? It's all wound up. The base is where I'm down at the main part, which is where the oval window is. You can kind of see the stapes there going against it. And the apex, so as I'm winding up into that little shell, I'm getting to the apex. And so it's getting narrower and narrower, and I'm trying to show this with the blue lines in my not so excellent picture, that I'm going from the base to the apex. If I'm taking that little shell and I'm pulling it out straight, okay, I'm pulling it out straight, what's happening with the basilar membrane itself is that it's going in the opposite direction. It is narrower at the base and it's stiffer at the base. Okay, it is wider and more flexible at the apex. And if you don't have any kind of piano and you can't get yourself to some kind of piano store that you can just go look in, it's one of those music shops that you can just go look in the backs of pianos, and especially if you have any access to a grand piano, but even like any piano, you can see that when we're down at the low notes, we have these kind of longer, looser wires, and we're up at the high notes and doing that ting, ting, ting really high, we have these short, tight wires. And so you have to kind of imagine this basilar membrane. It is narrow and stiff or tight, there at the base. They're longer and looser, or less tight, freer up at the apex. So we have our low frequency sounds towards the apex and our high frequency sounds towards the base. And Becchese's point was that it depends on the place along this basilar membrane where we see the most kind of vibration, and that's what how we're gonna code for pitch. Just like it looks just kind of like the strings on a piano.